Have you ever paid for respect and still been treated like you didn't belong? He had in a charcoal gray suit, polished shoes, and a first-class ticket printed boldly with his name, Dorian Hayes. A black CEO who had spent his entire life working to no longer be judged by the color of his skin. And yet, in the moment the flight attendant looked up, her eyes said more than words ever could. "You don't belong here." Then came the calm, cutting sentence. "Sir, this is first class. You might have the wrong boarding pass." This wasn't the first time. For men like Dorian, every glance, every dismissive word was an old scar reopened memories of fine restaurants that once refused to serve his father, of boardrooms where he had to prove he was qualified just to sit at the table. The worst part wasn't losing a seat. It was the message, "You're not worthy." But if you could turn your most humiliating moment into a stage for the world to hear, would you, if, in just a few minutes, you could flip the script from offended passenger to the man who forced an entire airline to kneel before public outrage? Would you have the courage to do it? Dorian Hayes did. 6 minutes after being escorted to economy, every camera on national television was pointed at him. 6 minutes later, the hashtag Shajtai First Class for who exploded into a storm. 6 minutes later, a century-old airline was trembling as it typed out a public apology wishing it had never opened its mouth. If you've ever witnessed or lived through a moment like this, share and subscribe so this story travels farther. Because this isn't just about one insulted passenger. This is a courtroom of justice held at 35,000 feet. And this is how Dorian Hayes exposed an entire airline with just 6 minutes of silence. Ask ChatGPT. Dorian Hayes stood at the entrance of first class like he'd just stepped onto a stage that wasn't quite set. His dark gray suit fit perfectly. His black shoes gleamed under the plane's warm overhead lights. One hand on his carry-on, one hand holding a ticket he didn't need to look at it. He knew exactly which seat he'd paid for. This wasn't his first time flying first class. But he had never stopped noticing the looks in spaces like this, the kind of looks that didn't see him. Only the question of whether he belonged. The flight attendant blocked the aisle, her carefully painted face a practiced mask for every situation. Her eyes skimmed the ticket in his hand, then lingered on his face a beat too long. A smile appeared not friendly, but the kind of smile used to politely close a door. "Sir, this is first class. You might have the wrong boarding pass." Her tone was light, almost casual, but Dorian heard the subtext clearly. "You don't belong here." Her words fell like a thin curtain between two worlds, one of privilege, one of suspicion. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he held out the ticket, letting the bold print Dorian Hayes. Seat 2A do the talking for him. The attendant froze for half a second, searching for a graceful way to excuse her surprise. Behind her, Dorian caught the stare of a white man in a polo shirt and expensive watch, sizing him up from head to toe. It was a familiar look, the one that silently asked, "How did he get here?" Dorian smirked, just enough to make the attendant's polite mask falter. But he didn't argue. Instead, he nodded. "I'll head back," he said, not because he was wrong, but because he knew some battles aren't won on someone else's stage. He turned, pulling his suitcase toward economy. Every step echoed like a quiet refrain, a mix of restraint and the kind of self-control that carries its own power. People watched him go, unaware that the real story had just begun. Sometimes, silence is the hardest hit, and Dorian Hayes had never thrown a punch without calculating the impact first. He said nothing more, but he would make sure everyone on that flight remembered him. What makes a man willingly give up a first-class seat he paid for? It wasn't humility. It was strategy. As Dorian walked toward economy, each step dragged old memories back with it. Some things stain your memory like ink on white fabric impossible to wash out. His mother had told him that when he was a boy sitting in the back seat of their beat-up car, you can buy the seat, but you can't buy their respect. Back then, he hadn't fully understood. Now he did. He remembered the first time his father took him to a fancy restaurant. They sat quietly at a waiting table by the door, watching mostly white families get served first. His father's hand squeezed his shoulder gently, as if to say, "Be patient, son." But his eyes told a different story, the story of a man who knew he was being kept outside the game. That same look was in the flight attendant's eyes today, in the man in the polo shirt, in every glance that measured his worth not by his name or work, but by his skin. He remembered boardroom after boardroom where a black CEO had to speak twice as much, prove 3 times as hard, just to be heard like everyone else. All of those moments stacked invisibly on his shoulders not just his burden, but the weight carried for those who came before him and those who would come after. In his seat in economy, Dorian didn't loosen his tie. He straightened his collar and sat tall. Some would think he'd accepted being pushed out of privilege. In truth, he was choosing his battlefield. He knew exactly how this world worked. The polite refusals, the apologetic smiles, they were just veneers covering a system that still closed doors for certain people. He wasn't unfamiliar with being doubted, but today, he had no intention of sitting quietly as decoration for those stares. Silence has its own power, and Dorian Hayes was a man who knew how to turn that silence into law. He scanned the cabin, committing faces and details to memory, not out of self-pity, but for preparation. Some wounds only hurt when left to fester. Others can become weapons when cut open at the right moment. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment as if resting, but behind them, a plan was coming together. They thought he was just another passenger being sent back, but Dorian Hayes had never been the type to follow someone else's script. In 6 minutes, the world would know exactly where he was sitting and why. People think drama lives in explosions. Dorian knew real power lives in the quiet before the thunder. He didn't argue, no raised voice, no fight, just a nod, a turn, and a slow walk to economy playing along with their script. But that wasn't surrender. It was how a man takes control of a story from behind the curtain. The flight attendant exhaled, relieved, thinking the issue had been settled. She didn't know that settled was an illusion. When a man like Dorian stays quiet, it isn't because he lost. It's because he's giving others just enough rope to write their own ending so he can rewrite it himself. He sat down and opened his laptop. The glow lit his face not of a humiliated passenger, but of a man about to activate his power. Dorian didn't need to shout for justice. He had other tools. Tools that could make an airline bow not just to him, but to every passenger they'd ever treated like they didn't belong. There was an irony Dorian always appreciated. The people who thought they controlled the space were often just extras in a scene they didn't know was being filmed. When that attendant sent him to economy with a polite smile, she thought she was preserving order, but order only takes one touch to collapse. And Dorian held that switch in his hand. The steps unfolded in his mind. 6 minutes. In 6 minutes, first class would no longer feel like a fortress. In 6 minutes, the very people who saw him as an intruder would realize they were sharing a flight with a coming media storm, and this time the storm wouldn't be outside the window. It would start right here, from an economy seat. Dorian smiled faintly. The smile of a man who had just opened the first act of a play his audience didn't even know they'd bought tickets for. They thought this was the end of a small mistake, but Dorian Hayes had just turned it into the opening scene of a national scandal. And in 6 minutes, the name Dorian Hayes wouldn't just be on a boarding pass, it would be on headlines an airline could never live down. Seat 14C. Cramped, aisle side, the recline just enough to remind you this isn't a seat for anyone who expects to get comfortable. Dorian set his laptop on the tray table, fingers brushing the keyboard but not typing. He wasn't in a rush, in this cabin. Silence was a form of observation. Through the thin curtain separating the cabins, he saw them the first-class passengers, laughing easily, sipping wine like they were the only ones who existed at 30,000 feet. Sometimes their eyes drifted toward economy not to find anyone they knew, but the way one might glance at a neighborhood they'd never step into. A whisper floated back, quiet enough the speaker thought it would drown under the hum of the engines, but loud enough for Dorian to catch. Probably used miles. A man's voice. Gravelly, someone treating himself to first class after a business trip. He wasn't talking to Dorian, but talking about him as if such assumptions were his birthright. Dorian tilted his head back, eyes fixed on the space ahead. This wasn't the first time he'd heard words like that. He knew that tone, the blend of curiosity and arrogance, the need to justify the presence of a black man in a space like this. It echoed the questions he'd heard at conferences. How long have you been working here when he was, in fact, the one running the company that employed them? A flight attendant pushed the service cart past, professional smile in place, but her eyes skipped over him. Dorian recognized this kind of not seeing. It wasn't carelessness. It was a boundary. He was a passenger, but not one of the passengers she'd extend warmth to. Dorian took a deep breath. He didn't feel insulted. He felt amused. There was a sharp irony in this moment. They didn't know that the man in 14C could buy the entire first-class cabin if he wanted, and that ignorance would turn this into an expensive lesson. Those stairs were measuring his worth by outdated rulers. But Dorian Hayes hadn't boarded to be measured. He'd boarded to break the ruler. And soon, they'd learn that the guy using miles had a kind of power no first-class ticket could buy. He leaned back, letting the steady drone of the engines merge with his thoughts. This wasn't a new feeling. It was exactly like those mornings in the boardroom. Walking in as a CEO, but always having to prove he deserved the chair already engraved with his name. He remembered the eyes of colleagues during his presentations not listening, but weighing, deciding whether he was lucky enough to be there. Whether in a boardroom or 30,000 feet in the air, the rule was the same before you speak. Prove you belong. He remembered one meeting when a chairman asked, "Where did you work before this?" A simple question on the surface, but Dorian knew better. It wasn't about his past. It was about his present, a clever way of making him justify his seat at the table. Today, that question echoed in the whisper, probably used miles. The same measurement, the same instinct to exclude only now. It was happening in the sky. Dorian no longer let words like that scrape his skin. He'd learned to turn every cutting glance, every dismissive comment into fuel. His mother used to say, if they keep looking at you like an outsider, turn their gaze into a mirror. It wasn't just advice. It was survival strategy in a world where luxury seats came with locked doors. He glanced toward first class again. The men and women there didn't know they were playing roles in a story much bigger than them. To them, he was just a black man out of place. But Dorian saw it differently. They were living proof of a truth he was about to broadcast to the entire country, that money doesn't always buy belonging, but power can. And he was ready to use it. He smiled slightly, a smile that, if anyone noticed, they wouldn't know how to read, part irony, part promise. He knew that when the curtain rose, the ones laughing up front would be the first to witness an inversion they couldn't imagine. Dorian Hayes was no longer the one being measured. He was holding the ruler. And when the performance began, those judgmental eyes would become evidence in the trial he was about to stage mid-air. He unlocked his phone, scrolled past unread messages, and opened a private group chat with his media team. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately. Every letter on the screen wasn't a complaint about bad treatment, it was the switch on a machine he'd built long ago. He typed, only, "Get ready. It's time." Message sent. No explanation. None was needed. They knew exactly what it meant. Dorian set the phone down. Screen face down on the tray. He leaned back, eyes half closed like a man resting, though his mind was sharper than ever. This was what he did best, turn a small injustice into a stage large enough for the world to watch. Those glances from first class had handed him the perfect script. And this airline, unknowingly, had just walked into his production. A little boy 2 rows ahead peeked back at him, wide-eyed with innocent curiosity. Dorian smiled warmly, then shifted his gaze back to the thin curtain. It felt like a metaphor, all the doors he'd once had to push open with intellect and patience. But this time, he wouldn't need to step through. He'd tear it down for everyone to see what was behind it. His mother's words returned. If they won't give you a seat at the table, make sure the whole table has to look at you. He'd spent years understanding that lesson. Now he was about to execute it in a way only Dorian Hayes could, by using his personal power and his media machine to make the world face what it preferred to ignore. He opened his laptop, jotting a few notes. Not to make a plan, the plan was already in his head, but to keep his hands occupied while his mind worked. No one around him knew that from this cramped economy seat. A storm was brewing. He glanced up at the digital clock above the aisle 1042. 6 minutes. He told himself, 6 minutes from now, everything changes. They thought Dorian Hayes was just a passenger sent to the back, but in a few minutes, he'd turned this entire flight into a public courtroom no one was ready for. And when the clock hit 6, the name Dorian Hayes wouldn't just be on a boarding pass, it would be on every national headline. Dorian rotated his wrist, eyes settling on the gleaming black watch face. 6 minutes. Such a small number, but in the hands of someone who knows how to wield it. 6 minutes can rattle an entire system. He exhaled slowly, as if breathing in the stale air of economy and exhaling something else entirely preparation. He opened his laptop, setting it on the tray table. Slim, light, but inside it was more than data, it was an entire power network, built with sweat, blood, and years of being underestimated. His fingers rested on the keyboard but didn't type, like a seasoned marksman who never pulls the trigger without a target. Dorian knew every word he was about to fire would explode the moment it left the barrel. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, but in his mind, time ticked to a different rhythm, urgent, precise. 6 minutes. He thought about campaigns he'd launched, deals that shifted markets, and remembered every time he changed the game. It started with a small moment, a moment like this one. A flight attendant passed by, pushing the beverage cart, glancing at him quickly before looking away. He didn't look up. She didn't know she'd just walked into the frame of a story about to sweep the nation. In first class, a glass clinked. A man's laugh rang out. Dorian looked up, staring through the curtain as though through a stage backdrop. Behind it, the lead actors in a play about to debut sat, blissfully unaware they were about to be thrust under a spotlight. Dorian didn't need to stand, didn't need to shout, didn't need to turn this into a scene. He knew there are battles you don't win with noise. The laptop glowed. The clock ticked. And up here in the sky, he was preparing to turn silence into a weapon. This wasn't about one passenger and one seat anymore. This was about a man turning humiliation into a tool to expose an entire mechanism. And the clock was running. In 6 minutes, this laptop would turn the cramped confines of economy into the epicenter of a media storm. Dorian placed 2 fingers on the keys but didn't type yet. He let them rest there, feeling the cool metal. In his head, the thought circled, I won't scream. I'll let the world hear them in their own voices. He'd seen it too many times, confrontations where the wronged yelled, and those in power calmly rewrote the narrative to favor themselves. That's how the world works, turning outrage into hostility, turning cries for justice into non-compliance. If you scream, they plug their ears. If you stay silent, they dismiss you. But if you make them listen to their own voices, that's a verdict no one can appeal. Dorian was used to being made a stranger in rooms he built with his own money. He remembered a conference last year when the board chair had asked, in the friendliest tone, "Do you feel like you fit in here?" A question that sounded like care but really meant, "Do you belong here today, on this flight?" That same question echoed in the flight attendant's look, in the whisper, probably used miles. This wouldn't be another moment he'd swallow in silence. This time, it would be laid bare not for revenge, but so the world could see how deeply normalized injustice had become. It wasn't just about a seat, it was about a system, a mechanism running smoothly on cold politeness and welcome smiles that never reached people like him. 6 minutes. He had 6 minutes to turn a personal slight into a collective story. He wouldn't scream for justice for himself. He would hold up a mirror to the airline, forcing them to confront how they treat those who don't look like them. And when the entire country looked into that mirror, the airline wouldn't be able to pretend this was just a small misunderstanding. Dorian knew the difference between anger and strategy. Anger vents. Strategy makes systems answer. He straightened his back, smiling faintly at the thought. A cold smile, like telling himself, "Fine, let's put them on air in their own skin." He was no longer the passenger denied first class. He was the man about to make an entire airline answer to a nation. And in 4 minutes, this plane would become a courtroom no one could leave. He opened his email, the cursor blinking in the subject line like a painter's first brushstroke. He typed deliberately, each word a brick in the facade of a building live broadcast injustice at 30,000 feet. Short enough to provoke curiosity, sharp enough to cut through excuses. He didn't send it to lawyers. Lawyers would bury this in paperwork and drag it into a complaint no one read. Dorian didn't need a lawsuit. He needed a stage. And that stage was national television, where millions would hear the story unfiltered by legal departments. He typed in the email of a senior editor at a major news network, someone who'd once told him, "If you've got a big enough story, I'll put it in front of the country." This was that story. A fleeting moment of humiliation, turned into living proof of a subtle but relentless system of exclusion that needed exposing. CC his company's entire PR team, not just to prepare them, but to send a message. We don't bow. We own the narrative. They'd understand. They'd learned from him that PR wasn't just about protecting reputation, it was about reshaping power dynamics. His finger hovered over send. He paused, glancing at the cramped economy seat around him, then up at the curtain leading to first class. How ironic, a few feet apart, yet two worlds. And from this seat, he was about to pull them together not with reconciliation, but with exposure. Dorian pressed send. The plane remained steady, the engines humming like any other flight. But he knew in that instant, he'd created a tremor. One email, enough to pull an entire airline into a media storm they couldn't control. He closed the laptop, leaned back as if settling in for a nap, but the truth was, the game had just begun and he'd already made the first move. In 6 minutes, Dorian Hayes had turned an insult into primetime news. And when this plane touched down, the airline wouldn't be explaining itself to a passenger. They'd be answering to a nation. The meal tray landed in front of him with a standardized smile. Chicken or pasta, a question asked not out of care, but out of protocol. Dorian picked one at random. He couldn't even remember what he said. The attendant noted his choice, thanked him in that soft yet distant tone, then rolled the cart forward, never realizing that the man in 14C could rattle her entire career with a single email. The way she placed the tray gentle but decisive reminded Dorian of the countless times he'd been treated as an unofficial guest in upscale spaces present, but not really seen. He stared at the flimsy plastic container of food, a perfect caricature of the moment. Up in first class, they were sipping wine and laughing in wide leather seats, while here, He was served a cold plastic tray. It wasn't just a difference in service, it was a statement of value. He twirled the plastic fork, not intending to eat, but thinking. In first class. The man in the polo shirt threw his head back, laughing at some story Dorian couldn't hear. A woman tilted her phone to capture the perfect shot of her wine glass, sending it to someone a little proof of her elite experience. None of them knew that just a few rows behind, someone had already turned this moment into a national headline. Dorian leaned back, eyes still on the curtain. His calmness wasn't surrender. It was the kind of stillness that made people underestimate him. He knew most of his power came from being unreadable. That was the art of silence, letting them believe they were in control, right up until the board flipped. A child in the next row peered curiously at his tray. Dorian smiled, nodded at the boy, then sank back into his deliberate silence. He didn't need to explain himself to anyone on this flight. He didn't need to confront the attendant. He didn't need to plead with the passengers in first class. The time for words would come, and when it did, they wouldn't be words, they'd be a verdict. Dorian Hayes wasn't just sitting quietly. He was waiting for the moment to turn silence into the sharpest weapon in the sky. And when it struck, no one in first class would ever mistake him for a guest on points again. He spun the fork lightly, not from hunger, but as part of his thinking ritual. The paradox amused him. They all thought they were in control. The flight attendant believed she had resolved a customer incident. The first-class passengers were secure in their untouchable status, but none of them knew that at this very moment, the entire story had already left this cabin and was on its way to the editing desk of a national news network. His silence wasn't a void. It was a concealed weapon, sheathed until the moment it could cut the deepest. Dorian had spent his life in rooms where his voice was muted, where his presence was treated like an exception. He'd learned that the strongest form of resistance wasn't shouting until your voice gave out, it was letting them believe you'd accepted their rules, right before turning that illusion into a trap. He remembered closed-door meetings where silver-haired colleagues assumed he was there to diversify the image. They'd smile, praise his ideas, and then vote against them. But he'd found another way. Don't fight them in the room. Change the narrative outside it. Take the story to the public, where the court of opinion forces them to do the right thing. That wasn't just skill. That was survival. This flight was no different. The attendant didn't think she'd done anything wrong by denying a black man a first-class seat. To her, it was maintaining standards. The first-class passengers saw it as normal, because they'd never had to ask, who gets to sit beside me? But Dorian knew when this story went public that smugness would become evidence. He inhaled deeply, letting the quiet fill his lungs. Silent, but not to endure. Silent to collect every ounce of power for the coming strike. That was the part they'd never see coming, the quiet of a man holding the key to flip the entire game. Dorian Hayes wasn't swallowing his anger. He was forging it into a blade no one could see until it was used. And when it came down, the cut wouldn't just reach an airline, it would slice into the very way this society treats people like him. His phone buzzed on the tray table. Dorian glanced at the screen. A new text from the editor he'd emailed, "We're going live in 10. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Everyone involved already knew their roles. That one short message was enough to remind him the board was in motion. 6 minutes of silence, mistaken for passivity, had become the opening act of a nationwide broadcast. He set the phone down and let a faint smirk curve his lips. It wasn't the grin of a man who'd won. It was the grin of someone who'd just flipped the switch on a storm no one saw coming. The engines hummed steadily. Economy stayed quiet, like nothing had happened. But Dorian knew outside this metal tube, the media machine was heating up, the first-class passengers. The attendants still smiling their rehearsed smiles, none of them knew they were about to become the central figures in a story the country would dissect. He closed his eyes briefly, as if resting, but, in his mind, The scene was vivid, the anchor staring into the camera, reading the subject line of his email. Passenger shot video of the altercation looping on screen. Every word, every glance analyzed, and the question ringing live on air. Was this just an isolated incident or a snapshot of something much bigger? Who really gets welcomed into these spaces of privilege? He wasn't an activist, he was a strategist, but that's exactly why he knew how to turn personal experience into a public reckoning. A private apology wouldn't matter, a public one that forces an entire system to face itself. Dorian reopened his laptop, not because he needed to work, but because appearances matter. If anyone passed by, they'd see a businessman tapping away at a project, not a man weaponizing silence. Dorian Hayes didn't need to shout to be heard. He was about to make an entire country listen to itself. And when the broadcast began, it wouldn't just be the airline answering. It would be a mirror held up to a nation. 10 minutes after the last message, the world outside the cabin had already shifted. Twitter was on fire. The hashtag, first class for who erupted like a wildfire in dry woods, fueled by short clips from passengers. An anonymous account posted the moment the flight attendant bent toward Dorian, her voice smooth as butter but her words sharp as a blade. "Sir, this is first class. You might have the wrong boarding pass." Just hours ago, it had been a passing moment on a flight. Now, it was Exhibit A in a national debate. Clips were reposted, slowed frame by frame to catch every flicker of the attendant's eyes, every mocking smirk from a first-class passenger. A well-known journalist shared it with the caption, "Sometimes you don't have to shout. You just have to let the world see what happened." Hundreds of thousands began commenting. Many shared similar experiences buying luxury seats but being treated like they didn't belong. Others argued it was just protocol, but it was that very debate that pushed the hashtag straight to the top of the trends list. On Instagram, major accounts shared screenshots of Dorian's leaked email, live broadcast injustice at 30,000 feet. Those few words had become a rallying cry. An influencer wrote, "Just a handful of words, but enough to shake an entire airline. This is how you wield power the right way." Back in the cabin, Dorian still sat quietly in 14C, laptop open but untouched. He didn't need to do anything more. The phone in his pocket buzzed endlessly with notifications, but he ignored them. The storm was already here, and he knew no one could put it out, not even him. The man seated next to him glanced at his phone, saw the hashtag, then snuck a look at Dorian, suspicion in his eyes. Dorian only smiled the calm smile of someone who had just turned an airplane into a public stage while everyone else was still reading the script. This was no longer about a humiliated passenger. This was about a country staring into its own mirror. And when the live broadcast began, the airline would learn they weren't just dealing with Dorian Hayes, they were facing an entire public demanding answers. Dorian leaned back, closing his eyes. The steady pings of texts and calls kept vibrating in his pocket, but he let them ring unanswered. In that cramped seat, he gave himself a moment of stillness, a space to remember the years that had taught him how to survive. He imagined what his mother would say if she saw this. "You turned an insult into a stage." He could almost hear her voice, clear as if she were beside him. The woman who once worked 3 shifts to keep him fed, who bore pitying and disdainful stares with quiet pride, but still raised him to believe that no one had the right to define his worth. She would be proud not because he struck back, but because he did exactly what she taught him, use intellect and composure to turn pain into a tool. The old scars came rushing back. The first time he'd been refused service at a restaurant as a teenager, pulled away from a table because this isn't a place for you. The meetings where he'd been interrupted only for a colleague to restate his point and be applauded for it. He'd swallowed it all then, letting those moments sink like stones to the bottom of a river. But now he understood those stones weren't just weight. They were foundation. A foundation for this very moment. He opened his eyes, scanning the economy cabin strangers' faces. Stories he didn't know. Maybe somewhere on this flight sat someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be told. You don't belong here. And now, not just them, an entire country was watching. Dorian didn't feel triumphant. He felt purposeful. This wasn't about reclaiming a first-class seat. This was about forcing a system to look at him and through him, at what it had done to countless others like him. He wasn't just recounting an experience. He was rewriting how the world would remember it. And when this plane landed, the story wouldn't belong to Dorian Hayes anymore. It would belong to everyone who had ever been left outside the doors of power. He pulled out his phone. A new text from the editor was waiting. "We're live in 5. Are you ready?" Dorian let his fingers glide across the screen. "Ready when you are." Send, no emojis, no explanation. Just that enough to set in motion a broadcast that millions would watch. He set the phone on the tray table and leaned back, looking as calm as if he were preparing for a nap. But outside this cramped cabin, dozens of producers were lining up footage. Hundreds of thousands had joined hashtag #FirstClassForWho, and an entire airline's PR department was panicking, scrambling for a crisis plan. Dorian knew exactly what that meant from this moment on. He wasn't just a passenger. He was the one controlling the narrative. In first class, a man scrolled his phone in the lavatory and froze his own face staring back at him in one of the viral clips. The moment he'd smirked when Dorian was turned away. He glanced toward the curtain, as if to make sure Dorian hadn't seen his reaction, but Dorian didn't need to. He'd already predicted it. That's the power of making a moment public. You don't have to confront each person. You make them confront themselves. Dorian looked at the curtain again, this time with the faint smile of a man who had flipped the board. Everyone who once saw him as an outsider was now an extra in the performance he was directing. They didn't know their roles yet, but when the broadcast went live, the entire country would. Dorian rested an arm on the armrest and tilted his head. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to stand up and reclaim his seat. Instead, he'd done what they never saw coming, turned the moment they excluded him into a lesson they could never deny. Dorian Hayes hadn't just reclaimed his voice, he'd turned it into a microphone for a nation tired of being treated like outsiders. And when the live feed hit the air, the airline would wish they'd simply let him stay in the seat he'd paid for. The laptop screen reflected Dorian's face, no lines of exhaustion from the long flight, only the calm of a man stepping into a battle he'd chosen long ago. In the corner of the screen, a zoom window displayed the logo of a national news network. A producer's voice came through. "We're live in 3, 2, 1. The lighting in the cramped economy cabin wasn't made for live TV, but that was exactly what made the frame powerful. No polished backdrop. No studio shine. Just a man in seat 14C with unsuspecting passengers behind him, now silent witnesses. The anchor's voice cut in. "We're live with Dorian Hayes, CEO of a major media company who says he just experienced what he calls an insult at 30,000 feet. Mr. Hayes, what happened?" Dorian didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch for half a beat, just long enough to pull millions of viewers fully into his frame. Then his voice came low, steady, deliberate. "I wasn't denied because of my ticket. I paid for that in full. I was denied because of a look that said I didn't belong there. And today, I want the entire country to see it, to understand that sometimes injustice doesn't have to shout in your face. It just smiles and tells you you're in the wrong seat." The words sliced through the air. The anchor leaned forward, instinctively knowing this moment didn't need interruption. Across living rooms, office break rooms, and cafes nationwide, every screen became Dorian's stage. He didn't need anger in his tone. His calm made his story sharper than any accusation. And on the other side of the broadcast, those who thought they could dismiss this as a minor incident now realized they were being called to answer before a nation. Dorian Hayes wasn't just recounting an experience. He was holding up a mirror, forcing everyone watching to ask themselves if that were me. Would I have been welcomed? And this was just the beginning, because after these words, Dorian wasn't only speaking for himself, he was speaking for the millions who had been told they were in the wrong place. He drew in a deep breath, like absorbing the energy of the moment, and, strangely, he felt lighter. Not because his anger was gone, but because it had been shaped into something with meaning. He was no longer a humiliated man in first class. He was leading a conversation the society had avoided for far too long. In that moment, he stopped thinking about himself. He thought about the ones who'd never had a chance to speak, passengers quietly enduring extra ticket checks, employees sidelined from meetings they'd prepared for, gifted kids doubted because they exceeded expectations set for them. Dorian knew that feeling, being shut out of exclusive spaces, even after paying the full price to be there. He thought of his mother, of nights when she came home reeking of bleach, recounting days when coworkers called her by easier names instead of her own. She never had a moment like this, a chance to look into a camera and say, "This is wrong." And Dorian knew he wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for her, for every person who'd never been seen, never been heard, never been told, "You belong." The anchor broke his thoughts. "Mr. Hayes, what do you hope to achieve by speaking out?" Dorian allowed a small, knowing smile. This was his chance to say what so many wanted to scream but had never been handed a microphone to do so. "I don't need an apology for myself," he said, firm but composed. "I want the people running this airline to look at how they treat their passengers and understand that no polite smile can cover up discrimination." In that instant, Dorian realized he wasn't confined to this narrow economy seat anymore. He was standing in a much larger space where his words weren't just heard, but amplified, multiplied by all who understood this pain. Dorian Hayes was no longer an insulted man. He was a mirror for anyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. And within minutes, his words would force not just an airline but an entire public to decide stay silent or stand on the side of justice. When Dorian finished his answer, the live broadcast did more than air on TV. It struck a nerve. Viewers didn't just listen, they responded. On Twitter, #FirstClass, for who exploded from a single story into a movement. Strangers who had never met Dorian began sharing their own stories, being asked to re-verify tickets multiple times, being reassigned seats for not fitting the image of premium cabins. Personal memories came flooding out as if Dorian's words had opened a door they'd kept shut for years. Then the system began to shake. A financial news outlet reported airline stock drops 4% within 20 minutes of broadcast. Dorian saw the alert flash across his secondary screen. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. But he knew the blow had landed exactly where it hurt most. In this world, a few percentage points in market value outweighed 100 formal apologies. Emergency calls flooded the airline's headquarters. Their communications team scrambled, already overwhelmed. A company spokesperson appeared on air, attempting to calm the fire, but every carefully crafted statement was clipped, remixed, and reposted online with captions like, "Sound familiar." That's a template apology. The public wasn't just outraged, they were alert. Back in the plane, everything felt eerily normal. Passengers still ate, flight attendants still cleared trays, but Dorian knew the truth. This normalcy was a thin shell over the earthquake he'd triggered from seat 14C. He had turned economy into a command center. Silence wasn't submission, it was the hammer striking at the reputation of a century-old airline. A message buzzed in brilliant move. "The nation's with you," from a colleague at his company. Dorian read it, then set the phone down. He didn't need praise. For him, this wasn't about personal revenge. This was about delivering a lesson an entire system would never forget. Silence had once been seen as weakness, but today, that calculated silence had shaken an airline to its core. And this was only the prelude. Because Dorian Hayes knew their response was coming. And he was already prepared for the next move. Just hours after the broadcast, the airline finally broke its silence. The statement came as a neatly formatted PDF, a polite headline, an opening full of the usual corporate phrases. "We deeply regret. This does not reflect our values. We will review our procedures." Dorian read it on his phone like a script he'd seen 100 times before. Polished words, carefully chosen to soothe anger, yet so familiar they were meaningless. It was the kind of apology he'd seen too many times, not meant for the people who were hurt, but for the shareholders. It told the public, "We'll change." But it didn't tell Dorian or anyone like him, "We understand what we did was wrong." Media outlets immediately dissected every line. One journalist wrote, "An apology means nothing if it doesn't name the harm." Comments poured in, "Another template apology." If this is their value, then it's hollow. Dorian wasn't surprised. He knew the airline would take the easiest route, issue just enough of an apology to calm the outrage, but not enough to force real change. That's the instinct of corporations backed into a corner to the bare minimum to survive the storm. On the plane, a flight attendant passed by, clearing his empty meal tray. She had no idea that, outside this cabin, the company she worked for was scrambling to save its image, or that the executives were praying this apology would smother the fire Dorian had lit. He wasn't angry. He just smiled, a half smile of someone who had predicted every move. To him, that statement wasn't closure. It was an open invitation to the next act. Dorian Hayes wasn't waiting for an apology. He was waiting for the moment they realized an apology wouldn't be enough. And as the airline believed it had closed the story, Dorian was preparing a demand that would force them to sit down and listen. He scrolled back up, rereading each sentence in the statement. The words lined up like a memorized speech. "We regret Mr. Hayes' experience. We will review our processes to ensure this does not happen again. This does not reflect the values we strive for." Words not written to start a dialogue but to be forgotten in 24 hours. He smirked, not out of satisfaction. An apology isn't first class. He thought, "It does also. It's just the carpet they roll out when they're caught." That's what they always did, lay down a thin rug to cover the stain. Never clean the room. He thought back to other times boardrooms where CEOs apologized for unfortunate incidents. PR campaigns promising a commitment to change that really meant keeping the same old system in place. He'd long known these apologies weren't for healing. They were to buy time. And Dorian wasn't the kind of man who gave them time. He didn't want comfort. He wasn't looking for his ego to be soothed. What he wanted was far bigger, a real conversation about who gets to belong, who has the right to exist in the open to all spaces society reserves for the privileged. He didn't want the airline to make quiet promises, then return to business as usual. He wanted them stripped bare, forced to change at the core. In his mind, an idea began to take shape. If they were going to give him an empty apology, he would force them to turn it into an irreversible action. A fund, a reform program, a signed commitment, something big enough that they couldn't just pretend to forget. He took a slow breath, letting patience settle in. Years of being underestimated had taught him this. Don't react when you hold the advantage. Speak only when every word you choose will nail the door shut. Dorian Hayes didn't need them to make him feel better. He wanted them to feel uneasy until they truly changed. And the demand he was about to make would show them an apology was just the ticket to enter the real conversation. He typed his response directly under the email that had delivered the airline's statement. No thanks. No comment on their apology. Just sharp, clean words. I don't want compensation. I want an anti-bias training fund for all employees. He paused, staring at the words as if reflecting on his own intent, then added one final line. If you truly believe in the values you claim to uphold, start here. And hit send. In that moment, Dorian knew he'd changed the game. He had refused the role of a victim pacified with money and scripted apologies. He had chosen to become the man who would force them to confront what they didn't want to touch: their structure, their mindset, and the prejudice embedded in their culture. To him, this wasn't a request, it was an ultimatum. An airline could throw money at a scandal to make it go away, but creating a fund, mandating training, and publicly admitting their failures that would force them to acknowledge a deeper truth: their system created exclusion. He leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. This had long stopped being about him. Now, it was a measure for society itself to decide whether apologies would remain thin rugs over rot or become the first step toward cleaning the whole room. His phone buzzed, a message from a media friend. "You just made them choke. Brilliant move." Dorian chuckled softly, not at the praise, but because he knew he'd hit the nerve, forcing them to choose between change or being exposed under the harshest light possible. Dorian Hayes wasn't waiting for compensation. He was forcing them to pay a different price to look in the mirror and shatter the distorted reflection they'd been using to excuse themselves. And while the airline was still reeling, Dorian had already set them up for the final move they'd never see coming. The plane's wheels hit the runway with a soft bounce. The engines hummed lower, then fell silent, leaving only the familiar voice of the intercom. "Welcome to your destination. Thank you for flying with us." But no one clapped. No one let out the usual sighs of relief. Instead, a heavy silence settled in the cabin, the kind of silence shared by people who'd all witnessed something too big, too unspoken, to put into words. Dorian unbuckled his seatbelt, still sitting upright in 14C. His eyes flicked toward the thin curtain separating him from first class. It had never looked so flimsy. The people behind it were probably reading headlines they didn't know they were part of. He didn't need to see their faces to know the looks of judgment they'd worn earlier had now shifted to avoidance. A flight attendant walked the aisle, performing the usual post-landing routine, but when she spoke, her voice carried a tremor that training couldn't mask. "Thank you for flying with us, Mr. Hayes. It wasn't just polite, it was personal and heavy, like a confession." Dorian nodded once. He didn't answer. There was no need to make her feel small. He knew some battles were won not with words, but with the finality of silence. Silence that forced others to hear their own actions replayed in their minds. On this flight, that silence spoke louder than any accusation. A few passengers in economy stole glances at him, then quickly turned away when their eyes met his. No one said a word, but their looks told the story. That's the man who turned this flight into a national conversation. He rose, retrieving his suitcase from the overhead bin. Every motion was deliberate, as if he wasn't rushing to leave, but carefully closing a chapter. As he walked the narrow aisle, he could feel the quiet trailing behind him, not empty, but the kind of silence that lingers after people have witnessed something larger than they can explain. Dorian Hayes didn't need applause for landing. His victory was in making everyone on that flight sit with their own reflection. But beyond the hush, another door was opening, one that didn't come from the airline that had just apologized. Dorian lingered in his seat for a moment, staring out the small window. The late afternoon sky washed his face in cold gray light. Below, baggage carts scurried like ants. In the odd stillness of a just-landed plane, cut off from the noise outside, he felt time slow down. He remembered his mother's words, the compass she gave him for moments like this: "Don't let them forget you belong anywhere you set foot." As a younger man, he'd thought it was about confidence, but now Dorian understood it was deeper. Belonging wasn't granted. It was claimed through an unshakable presence. He had once mistaken victory for acceptance. He'd doubled his effort just to earn nods from people who'd never intended to acknowledge him. But today, reading the hollow press release, watching the airline try to extinguish the fire with polished words, He understood that real victory wasn't being accepted. It was being remembered, forcing them to never forget the moment they were made to see him. And everything he stood for. He thought of those who never got this chance, those who swallow humiliation every day to keep their jobs, their opportunities, their safety. The single mother asked to prove her first-class ticket. The student whose bag was searched because he didn't look like a frequent flyer. Faces he'd never seen but knew were out there. They were why he wouldn't settle for an apology, wouldn't take a settlement and let the story die. Dorian didn't need to win in the airline's eyes. He wasn't seeking personal comfort. He wanted one thing for this moment to be burned into their memory as a warning, so that next time they looked at a passenger and silently decided whether that person belonged, they'd remember Dorian Hayes and the cost of their contempt. He wasn't after recognition. He was after a mark deep enough that they'd never erase it. And just when he thought the story was over, another door opened, but not from the people he had just challenged. Dorian stepped off the plane as passengers shuffled to gather their belongings. The clatter of suitcase wheels mixed with the metallic snap of unbuckled belts. He walked slowly down the narrow aisle, passing through the curtain that once separated two worlds now useless as a barrier for anything that had been exposed. At the exit, the lead flight attendant bowed slightly. Her voice stayed professional, but softer, almost contrite, the tone of someone forced to acknowledge the man she had once dismissed. Dorian said nothing, just nodded. He hadn't come for apologies. He'd come to leave a mark, and he knew he had. At baggage claim, his phone buzzed. He didn't rush to check it. Outside, the airport roared with its usual chaos, but for him, time slowed again. The screen lit up an email. Mr. Hayes, we'd like to discuss a strategic partnership on staff training. The sender, the CEO of a rival airline. Dorian arched an eyebrow, reread the line to be sure he hadn't imagined it. A proposal not from the airline that had just scrambled to apologize, but from a competitor who saw an opening to redefine themselves. It wasn't just a door, it was a stage. He leaned against a pillar near the carousel, chuckling under his breath. The irony was almost sweet. The airline that told him he didn't belong had just handed him enough power to make their rivals see him as an architect of change. They had thought Dorian Hayes was just an insulted passenger. Now they'd have to face him as a force capable of reshaping the industry. He didn't reply right away. He knew the game had only just begun. This wasn't about a first-class seat anymore. This was about who would dare redefine belonging at 30,000 feet, and Dorian Hayes knew he'd be at the head of that table. He didn't walk out of the airport like a victim consoled. He walked out like a player opening the next move won, where he didn't ask for a seat. He decided who got one. And with a faint smile, Dorian knew this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.